Good day, two-wheel friends. Zack here with RevZilla, and welcome to another episode of Daily Rider, where we learn about motorcycles as we ride. Our guest today is the Triumph Bonneville T100. That is a 900cc parallel twin sitting at the center of one of the most stately and classic silhouettes in the history of motorcycling. Now, the Bonneville has been a lot of things over the years, right? Initially a bastion of performance and eventually reborn into this classically styled, polite entry-level motorcycle. That being said, the MSRP on this bike is just north of $11,000 and it weighs 500 pounds. So is it an entry-level motorcycle anymore? Where does it fit into the world of Triumph, into the world of motorcycling? And how much pedigree, how much quality do you get from this essentially base Bonneville? Well, let's ride to work and talk about it, shall we? All right. Okie dokie, everybody. Time for a quick sponsor call out, and it's very simple. This video is paid for by RevZilla.com. The way that we pay for this content, Daily Rider and other shows like it, the shop manual, CTXP, bike reviews, articles that we write, is to take money from the company coffers, money that the company makes selling motorcycle apparel and accessories to motorcycle enthusiasts such as yourself. This message is only meant to remind you that the next time you need anything for you or your bike, a helmet, jacket, tires, saddlebags, you name it, to buy it at RevZilla.com, because when you do so, you help support content like this. Alrighty. Triumph Bonneville T100. It gets a lot of credit for being a handsome motorcycle, and I mean I grew up around air-cooled bikes, old bike, vintage race bikes, and that kind of thing. So, you know, it's plucking at my personal heartstrings, but I think it's kind of undeniable that it's a classic shape, right? I mean, it's just like a handsome, basic motorcycle. And a lot of work went into that. I'd like to point out some of the things, if you don't mind. One interesting thing, these are liquid-cooled engines despite having these fins for air cooling, which provide some cooling, of course. But this radiator, which seems really obvious when you're this close to it, disappears a little bit when you step away from the bike, and that's sort of hiding in plain sight kind of way. And I appreciate the work that went into doing that with the modern Bonneville line, because liquid cooling helps keep the bike efficient and modern. But they chose to not be super garish about it, which I like. Another thing which is often appreciated on these bikes, but I have to call out, is this sweep of this exhaust, right? It looks very direct, just comes out of the header, shoom, straight back, just like it did in 1959. But if you get up close here, you can see there's a little bread box under here, catalyzer and all that jazz, and there's plumbing that comes out of this pipe and in here and under there and then back into the pipe and right here and then out. But it's all under this shield, which makes it really kind of elegant, and they hide all that stuff under the engine really, really nicely. Now, those are a couple things that I appreciate about the design of the bike. There are obviously plenty of cues that this is a new bike and not an old one, from the wheels, the brake, the size of the actual engine, the fact that these are, you know, fake carburetors and not real ones, the seam on the tank, that kind of thing. But there's just a lot of detail that goes into designing a bike like this, and I think that Triumph really deserves a tip of the cap, whether it's the sort of oxblood colored spark plug caps there, or I don't know, there's lots of things you can name. And we talked about this a little bit because I rode the Kawasaki Z650 RS, and I think I called it something like a half-baked retro bike, and I think this is just about as fully baked as a production retro motorcycle gets. It's really well done, even up close, and I definitely appreciate that. And I guess the last thing we can talk about on that topic is the dash, which of course we'll dive into the details a little bit later. But just sort of classic, chrome bezels and round gauges and a classic look. And a fuel tank cap that comes off in your hand and threads in. Classic look and feel everywhere you look and feel. And there it is. 270 crank parallel twin, sort of a classic thump. It has a pretty stroke heavy bore to stroke ratio, which means there's a fairly long stroke and a fairly small bore, though it still is over square. But it makes for sort of a lopey character. It makes for high torque figures and or relatively low power figures, which we'll experiment with. But can't deny that it sounds thumpy and bassy. All right, is that enough talking? I think that's enough talking. A car coming by here, smoking us out anyway. So let's ride to work. All right, we can talk about some basic specs here. I mentioned that this bike weighs 500 pounds, actually 504 pounds on the Daily Rider scales, and that was with a full tank of 3.8 gallons. What else? I also mentioned the price being just north of $11,000. It's a little bit of a tricky subject with this bike because this paint scheme is $11,500 approximately. A base black T100 I think is actually $10,995, so technically under $11,000. But I think presenting the MSRP around $11,000 or just north of, especially if you go for the two-tone paint, which you should, in my opinion, you know, then that's the actual price there, you know. Seat height is 31.1 inches, which feels about right. You could have convinced me that it was a little bit lower than that. It's very approachable, despite being pretty heavy bike in general. Yeah, 31-inch seat height is quite reasonable and very much feels that way. Last couple specs, horsepowers and torques. I think the claim is 64 horsepower and 59 foot-pounds of torque, something like that. So yeah, horsepower and torque numbers are fairly close to each other, which, like I said, is indicative of a relatively long stroke engine. And yeah, obviously this bike's not supposed to set the world on fire from a performance standpoint, but it is a fairly large engine, especially for a bike that's near the bottom of Triumph's lineup. So worth mentioning the power figures, I think. Really like the way it sounds. Sounds great. But how does it feel to sit on? Well, very classic. Probably won't be hugely surprised to hear that. Yeah, just a very pretty compact riding position. The seat to peg ratio is fairly short, or seat to peg distance, excuse me, is fairly short. You can kind of choose how far from the handlebar you sit, but if you sit near the front of the seat, as I usually do, it's not a bad reach to the handlebar. The handlebar, I think, kind of looks wider than it feels. It, again, pretty compact, kind of narrow, and but overall just a very basic riding position. It's the in some ways the quintessential motorcycle silhouette and appearance, and in a lot of ways it's also a quintessential two-wheeled experience to sit in the saddle. It's just pretty basic, fairly upright, nothing too surprising. Right out onto the freeway, and we'll use a little bit of this roll-on power, all 60 some odd horsepower. See if we can get by this Accord hybrid. Yes, up to 80 miles an hour. No big deal. One thing I really like about the transmission is that the spacing of the gearing is really nice. They're nice broad spaces between the gears, which was probably done out of necessity since there's one fewer gear than usual. But I just wish that more brands did this kind of thing. I just get so fed up riding bikes and shifting from 5th to 6th gear and being like, what even happened? Did we go? I see the tachometer went down 300 RPM, but like, come on, give me an overdrive, you know? I just like the way that Triumph approached this gearbox. I think it works quite well. Exhibit A here is cruising along at 4,000 RPM, about 75 miles an hour, and just happy as can be. A little bit of a pulse from the engine through the foot pegs and through the handlebar, but nothing that I would call annoying at all. It just feels like you're riding a motorcycle. It's great. It's so comfortable. Do this all day. No problemo. And on that topic, actually, boy, did I get a lot of comments on the my social media post about can you take this bike touring, because anyone who listens to our High Side Low Side podcast will tell you that my lovely colleague Spurgeon Dunbar is always talking about how he crossed the country on his Triumph Bonneville and what a formative experience it was, and I appreciate that very much about my friend Spurge. But you know, so it's a gag for us on the RevZilla staff that like, oh, it's a touring bike or a Triumph Bonneville. But you know, jokes aside, there isn't any wind protection. But like, it's a perfectly happy machine to trundle along like this. It's great. Yeah, put some luggage on it, strap your tent to the back of it. Absolutely, take it touring. Why not? And on the topic of touring, gas mileage figures were right around 40 to 45 is what we recorded on our staff rides, which obviously can depend greatly on how fast you're going and what you're doing. But 3.8 gallon tank's not huge, right? It's kind of on the small side for a fuel tank, but still you'll get 150 miles probably, especially if you're being careful. I think that's just about acceptable for a bike like this. What else we got to talk about here on the old T100 on the highway? Mirrors, I suppose. They could be a little bigger, but I'm a bit of a mirror snob, as anyone will tell you. They work pretty well. They're nice and smooth. I appreciate that. Nice solid mount, and they do a fine job. And they're, just like the rest of the bike, awfully handsome, if you ask me. So no complaints, really. Right, into town, and a place where the Bonneville, despite being a 500-pound bike, is historically quite good. It's, I think, seen as a good city bike. And these stop sign challenges will show, okay, that one wasn't great. I think we got our 0 mph feet up stop, but it wasn't super elegant. But more to the point, one of the things this bike does well is carry a lot of the weight quite low. And because the weight is substantial, there's a sense of stability there. And that's kind of that's a trope of motorcycling, that like, oh, you want a nice heavy bike so it doesn't get blown around in a crosswind. But there's a certain amount of truth to it. I screwed up that one, that's no good. But in general, this bike is not, you know, like supermoto agile, but it's very predictable and easy to use in these situations. And that's helped out by a transmission and a clutch that I think are pretty communicative, especially considering, son of a gun, I messed that one up too. Considering the class of the bike, which is, again, on the border of entry level. One note about the clutch and transmissions, I think they're a little finicky when they're cold, in my opinion. The clutch, I think, can be a little bit, there we go, can be a little bit grabby when it's cold, and it's like kind of sometimes a little hard to find neutral, it feels like, when the transmission's cold. But I guess the good news there is that it's not cold for very long, provided you're going on a ride that's longer than 5 or 10 minutes. And other than that, I think the controls are work quite well, and there's a whiff of quality, I think, in general. The levers are adjustable, which is nice, and yeah, the transmission just has that nice feel when you go from gear to gear, where it's gives you a nice satisfying clunk on your toe. It's good. Alrighty, this light usually takes approximately forever, so let's talk about that dash, huh? If only every dash were this easy to describe and talk about. Yeah, speedo, tachometer, all the sort of warning lights and whatnot built in there, and then these two little LCDs. This one here has the fuel gauge and range, is what it's showing right now, and then this info button over here on the left dash, or left handlebar, excuse me, we'll cycle through some of this stuff. So you're showing trip 1 right now. That's gear position indicator in the upper left, which is nice to have, not a need to have, I don't think, on this bike. And as you can cycle through, see trip 2, live miles per gallon. Oh, that one's 48 miles per gallon. You see that? Okay, so I might have underestimated there. The time of the morning that I'm going to work, which we can ignore. Traction control on, and I think if you hold this down, it goes TTC off. Which is a thing you can do if you want to. I think that this bike doesn't really need traction control, but let's talk about that later, shall we? In general, super clean dash to look at, to engage with. I think it's just really nicely done, and yeah, a lot of respect for how pretty it is to look at and how easy it is to use. The last note I'll make riding around town here will be to do with the noise from the exhaust on this bike, which I'll talk more about the engine later, but I find oh geez, that's so bad. I find the noise quite satisfying from this engine. Just yeah, makes a real nice, pleasant noise. I don't think it's loud enough to be obnoxious when you're riding around neighborhood like this, but it's fun, it's satisfying, and it's a really, really nice balance, in my opinion. Okay, on to Lover's Lane here. You won't find any surprises in the passenger department. I don't know what else to say. The seat's fairly wide and thick back there. There's not a huge imbalance between the rider accommodations and the passenger accommodations. Of course, as I often point out, a flat seat means if you have a tall rider and a short passenger, it'll be hard for them to see. But aside from that, no big bombshells to report in the passenger department. We're getting spritzed on a little bit here. You're gonna have to be careful of the slippery sections of the twisty road. So if and when you do dip into a twisty road section such as this one, whether it's wet or dry, I think what you'll find is a really kind of engaging experience. It's not a sport bike, obviously. It's not super light to flick from side to side. It doesn't have any ambitions of thrilling the pants off you on a road like this. The thing I like about it is the balance that the bike offers. The balance of kind of damping and spring stiffness in the suspension allows you to feel the road. It doesn't do anything interesting. It's just not bad, and that I appreciate, because the rest of the bike is so much fun to enjoy on a road like this. Like the shifting, like I just really get a lot of pleasure a bike like this with a heavy flywheel and sort of a lumbering engine, drifting into corners and blipping the throttle in a downshift and then coming out of corners like this and just gently shifting, and there's a sort of mellow satisfaction to it all. It's very kind of meditative and soothing, which if you don't want your twisty road experience to be that, then maybe this bike isn't for you, but I very much appreciate it. Alrighty, down off of the crazy misty summit of Palos Verdes and back onto surface streets here. Old Katoom rider. All right. Now, to change gears a little bit, figuratively that is, one of the things I want to talk about are the differences between the T100 and the now Speed Twin 900, the artist formerly known as Street Twin. It is the same engine and the same platform in many ways. The T100 just sort of has this classic look. It has the two-tone paint. It has the chrome badges on the tank. It has the wire spoke wheels, stuff like that. And the... let's test the brakes. All right. And the Speed Twin 900 has this sort of more like you know, modern retro look. It's got the cast wheels and sort of like matte paint. It also has one gauge up here instead of the twin gauges, so it's like a little bit more modern. It's a little bit more minimalist, which is neither here nor there, only to point out that there is a difference between the two, and the Speed Twin 900 is a little bit cheaper as well. All right, so talking of other pieces of the Triumph lineup, I feel like it's worth mentioning that this bike does use the 900cc engine, not the 1200cc engine from the T120 or the larger scramblers or the Thruxton bikes like that, the Speed Twin 1200, etc. But from a design standpoint, they're pretty similar, and the vibe is similar, you might say. They're strong, but not excitable, really. All right, since we caught this red light, let's talk about brakes, because I got something to say about that as well. I use a lot of rear brake on this bike because the rear brake's pretty good, but also because the front brake is kind of bad. It's not okay. It's not bad. It's just it's not enough brake, in my opinion, for a 500-pound bike. Just a single disc. It does have steel braided lines, but it could use a little bit more brake. So I just add some rear brake, which is what they teach you to do in MSF anyway, I suppose isn't a bad habit to have. I think it's objectively the worst part of this bike, but I understand it from a model perspective. You know, it's a visual differentiator between the larger 1200cc bikes, which have twin discs, and also, you know, to a certain extent, it's one of the entry points into the modern classic line that Triumph has. Another thing I'd like to talk about regarding the engine on this bike is I sometimes talk about, like, is the engine the reason to buy the bike? And I think in a functional sense with the T100, it's not the reason to buy the bike. It's a nice engine. It works really well. It's pleasant. It's strong. But somehow it doesn't call to me the same way it does visually. I think it just, the combination of how it works, which is fine, above average, but fine, really pairs nicely with how it looks to me. It just is such a beautiful power plant. It's really nice looking. The contrast cut on the fins and the pipe we talked about, the look of it is great. One thing that I find myself tripping over a little bit with this bike is it just feels so complete and so well thought out, and just such a lovely balance of usability, of functionality, and of style. And I can't help but reflect and think that people are cross-shopping with Harley-Davidson 883s or 1200s. And maybe that's not the case. Maybe you're thinking, what? No way. That's not even on my radar. I don't care. When I ride those Harleys, I get a very different sort of raw feel. And I think in some ways they're similarly styled, right? It harkens back to a sort of a different era. And those engines are actually air-cooled and this is liquid-cooled. But I don't know. I guess where I'm going with this is I can't help but ride this bike and think that this amount of kind of quality feeling is something that Harley Davidson's got to be eyeballing, right? They got to have at least one eye on this kind of bike, and how it feels to ride, as opposed to being kind of a little bit more raw and clattery like those air-cooled Harleys are, which is its own thing, you know? Like, I appreciate those bikes for what they are. I just can't help but think that this is just sort of feels like a little bit heavier and classier timepiece. I don't know. Anyway, aside from the look of the engine, it's also probably worth pointing out that this engine doesn't really mimic the old Triumphs the way that it used to. Those were 360 cranks, I think. Yeah, I'm actually not off the top of my head. Someone will correct me in the comments if I'm wrong, I'm sure. The point is, older Triumphs from the 50s and 60s, they didn't have the 270 crank, the 90-degree crank pin offset that's so common in parallel twins these days. So to me, it almost is a little bit inauthentic in that way, because it doesn't sound or feel like a classic Triumph. It does sound and feel good, as I've said, quite good, but that's notable, I think, that it's a departure for the brand, the way that the engine functions and sounds and feels, for whatever that's worth. But luckily I don't have to talk about that anymore, because we're on to the part of the ride where I circle back on my initial question, right? Where does this bike fit into the world of motorcycling and Triumph? I think that where it fits into Triumph is the most pertinent thing to address, because I think that the fact that Triumph came out with the gosh, what's it called? The Trident 660 is obviously a very different, you know, it's a completely different engine. It's a different style of bike. But it did feel to me as though Triumph wanted this bike, the T100, to hold a slightly higher station in the world of entry-level, quote-unquote entry-level motorcycles, or entry-level pieces of the product line, because it is stately and it is such a big seller. And I think that that's fair. And I think the Trident 660 is a cool bike too. But I think this bike being elevated a little bit kind of makes sense. All right, on to the dirt road shortcut, which will be a fairly short discussion of how this bike is as an off-road bike. One thing you do get with a classic bike like this, right? It's classic upright riding position and basic ergonomics, is a certain amount of command over the bike. You know, you're not like hunched forward like you're on a sport bike, which is bad for this type of terrain. And yeah, you know, trundle down a dirt road, sure, why not? There's nothing that Bonnie can't do. Just ask Virgin Dunbar. As for that trash control, let's experiment with that, shall we? It's extremely conservative. Wow, look at that. So wide open. Very, very conservative. And just because, oh, hey now, ABS is less conservative, I would say, just because it's tradition here on Daily Rider to kick up some dust. Let's shut it off for the next 100 yards or whatever we have here, and see how it works as a flat tracker. Nice. Oh, the rear ABS seems a bit more. One thing you get with this type of engine, sort of like lopey, torque-rich style of engine, is when it does spin up like that, when the rear wheel does spin, it's quite predictable and manageable. So, you know, if you're flat tracking your T100 down some gravel roads over in Timbuktu there, you'll be pleased to know that. All right, it's time to try to wheelie this thing, and I haven't really done much of that. I don't think we're going to get much here, you guys. Whoa! Okay. I wasn't expecting that. Let's try again. There we go. The transmission is a little more deliberate than I want to try and grab a gear while we're doing it, but there you go. I was not expecting that. I thought I was just gonna, I was only gonna get protests from the T100 when I try to do a wheelie. But you know, 900 cc's is 900 cc's. No replacement for displacement, as they say. And there you have it. It's more of a wheelie monster than I was expecting. All right, next question to answer is about backing it in, and I don't think we're going to get much here. Let's try. Oh, no. It's a very rear heavy motorcycle, and the front brake is not super sharp, as I said, so it's hard to get the weight transfer going, and it's not something the bike wants to do, and the ABS is not particularly adjustable. I got a little back in there. I like hooning around and backing it as much as the next guy, but I can understand this bike not being, you know, doing that. Really, I think it kind of makes sense. All right, first gear. Yeah, the transmission is a little. Some of my colleagues commented on the transmission, said they didn't like it. I think I might have a little bit of a soft spot for antiquated transmissions. Growing up around vintage bikes, I think it might be harsh to call this transmission antiquated, but it's not fully modern, I don't think. Okay, U-turn challenge. Here we go. We don't have enough parking space to go for it, so we're going to line up on this line here, and we're going to go full lock to the left. Ooh, the steering lock's not super. What's that? Yeah, still 2.4, 2.3 parking spaces maybe. That's not too bad, I suppose. I was going to say not too bad. It kind of sums up this bike, but it's more than that. It's better than that. It's better than not too bad. It's 900 cc's and it's 500 pounds, but it is approachable and reasonable and pleasant and engaging and good looking, and I don't know, it doesn't do a lot wrong for me. Does that sound great? Stock pipes? I don't know. It's just like such a nice amount of noise. Like you feel like you're on a you know, a true machine forged in the bowels of an English factory. Or, you know, built in Thailand, whatever. The point is, it's stately. I've used that word already, but I got to come back to it. It's just, it's great. It's such a good experience. It's so pleasant, so nice. Okay, so let's answer some Instagram questions here, see what you all had to say. Okie doke. First question here is from Brickhouse Builds, a repeat Daily Rider question asker. And Brickhouse Builds asks, and I quote, "Even though this bike is modern in production, does it still create any vintage feel or emotion when riding?" This is a great segue into what I was just talking about, right? Yes, from the transmission, which is arguably not as slick as it could be, to the front brake, which is arguably not as sharp as it could be, to the looks, which are sharper than they need to be. It does create an old feel, I think. It is more modern, I think, than old. Anyone who's ridden an actual old bike will tell you that there's a very different feel there. But yeah, Triumph has captured some of that. Hopefully I captured some of that during this ride. But yes is the short answer, and I know you wanted me to expand, but hopefully this ride has expanded on the things that I like and the things that I appreciate about how the bike feels to ride and how it connects you to the road and to the experience of riding a motorcycle. Next question is from Haha Poor, who asks, is it worth paying more to get the T120 with the bigger 1200cc engine, or is the 900cc engine enough for day-to-day use? Good question. So we talked about this with the Ducati Street Fighter V2, I think, and then I said this whole thing about how I like the smaller V-twin engine from Ducati. Well, that bike has the 955 sort of like mini Panigale thing, right? The over square, whatever. The point is, I like those bikes because they have plenty of power. A Multistrada V2, a Hyper Motard, a Ducati Desert X, plenty of power to get around and do what you need to do. They're great. They're super engaging. You don't necessarily need the V4. And I feel the same way about these Triumphs. I like the 1200cc engine. I think the Triumph Speed Twin 1200 is one of my top motorcycles available today. I just love that bike. I think it's such a excellent blend of power and of handling and of looks and all that stuff. So if you want more power, you could get a 1200, but do you need it to go 80 miles an hour on the freeway? No. Do you need it to get across town? Of course not. Do you need it to get across the country? No, you don't. This engine's fine. It's plenty strong to do whatever you need to do, in my opinion. Next question is from Old Rally, who asks, not going to ask the Royal Enfield 650 comparison question for the 35th time, but I think this should be addressed. Fair enough. And there were other questions about the Royal Enfield, specifically, I think, the INT 650, which was covered here on Daily Rider. Please feel free to reference that episode. I think the INT 650 is a really good bike. I really like that bike. Is it worth paying more for this bike? Well, in some ways, there's a bit of a badge tax, right? You have to pay more because Triumph invented this kind of the Bonneville and this shape, and I think in some ways it is actually a bigger and higher quality piece, I think, right? The engine is quite a bit bigger. INT 650 compared to this 900cc Triumph engine does feel smaller. It's not as powerful. It's not as burly. It sounds good. It feels good. The INT 650 is a great option if this is too expensive, if this is too much, if it's too heavy, if it's more power than you want. I think that they coexist quite nicely, frankly. I don't think that they're direct competition. I think this bike is at least a half step above that bike from a quality standpoint, from an engine size standpoint, and I really like that INT 650. But I don't think that one person should look down their nose at the other person, if that makes sense, between INT 650 and a Bonneville T100. I like both bikes, and I think that they can coexist. We can all just hold hands and sing Kumbaya, you know? Next question is from Thomas Izzo, who says, is this the motorcycle that looks more like a motorcycle than all other motorcycles? Yeah, you know, I think it is. And I like that question, right? Because it's digging at this sort of like, is this the closest thing to the definition of a motorcycle? And maybe it is, and maybe it isn't from your standpoint. Maybe you're not into this type of bike and you don't understand why people like the classic look so much, the chrome, the two-tone paint, the round headlight, the metal fenders, blah blah blah. Like, why do people care about that? And if that's the case, fine, but you have to respect history. You respect your elders, don't you? And I think that this question really digs at the idea that we have a specific look in our mind when we think about a quote-unquote motorcycle, or when maybe people who don't know about motorcycles think about a motorcycle, the purest sense of the word. And maybe this is it in one way or another. I think it deserves a whiff of respect for that reason, and I kind of like the comment. The last question is from Sahil Sarivastava 57. Did I say that right? I have no idea. This is a great question. I love it. It reads, if this were an NBA player, who would it be? This is a great question. I friggin' love it. I went to our CTXP director and producer, Spencer Robert, for this question. He's a more attentive NBA fan than I am. And he had a great answer. He said Jerry West. And if you don't know who Jerry West is the silhouette of the NBA logo. Can we put it on screen there? Maybe we can put it on screen. Anyway, so when you see the NBA logo, you see a silhouette of a guy dribbling a basketball. That's Jerry West. One of the most prolific scorers in the history of the NBA, arguably one of the greatest of all time. Also a little bit obscure, sort of like obscure but hidden in plain sight, right? Every single time you see the NBA logo, you see Jerry West. But not necessarily everyone knows who Jerry West is. Certainly not like they know who Michael Jordan is or LeBron James or someone like that. Maybe that's the Bonneville T100. I like that answer. I think it's long-standing, been around since the late 1950s. It's a classic. It's famous. It's served many tours over the years. It's been a hugely successful model for Triumph. So I like that. That's what I'm going with. I like Spencer's answer, and we're going with that. Jerry West. And I think that's an excellent question. Love those allegory questions. Thanks so much. All right, let's put the sucker on the Daily Rider leaderboard, and I can let you go.
All right, everybody, here we go. We are at RevZilla West. We are at the Daily Rider leaderboard, and we have a Triumph Bonneville T100 in the hopper, ready to go. As a friendly reminder of what we have on the leaderboard here, we got the SV650, the GSX-8S, both from Suzuki, and then you got your Kawasaki Z650 RS, Honda CB500X adventure bike, and a Ducati Street Fighter V2. And I bring up the top 5 because I think the Bonneville T100 is going to be in the top 5. I feel confident about that. We'll see how it shakes out, but I feel like that's what's going to happen. Is it better than a Street Fighter V2? If I could have either one for free, I'd probably take a Street Fighter. But a Bonneville it's pretty easy to make the argument that it's a better daily rider. It's more approachable. I think it's better looking, but that's subjective. I don't know. Yeah, it's better than a V2. Is it better than a CB500X? CB500X is a really good bike. I do think the riding experience that you get from a Bonneville T100 is better than a CB500X, even if you can't do quite as many things with the Bonneville. It's an elevated experience. It's a higher quality piece. It's better. It's better. Is it better than a Z650 RS? Now this gets pretty tight here. It gets pretty tight here at the top. I think the Bonneville is, heavier. It's not as good as a sport bike, but it's fun on a twisty road. We talked about that, right? Like it engages the rider, and it feels in some ways like a sort of a truer, more foundational and more primal kind of motorcycling experience than the Z650 does. So I don't think the Z650 delivers anything that the T100 can't do. And I do think the Triumph delivers, more of the classic feel and energy of, like a retro bike than the Z650 does, and that's what they're both going for. Is the GSX-8S better than a Bonneville? Doesn't look as good. Doesn't feel as good. But yeah, it's better. the Gix 8S is a good motorcycle, and it has a quick shifter, which is imperfect, but it does have a quick shifter, and the quick shifter is sporty, and the brakes are quite good, and just like functionally as a motorcycle getting across town, it is better. It is better. So the T100 is going to go here. Come on. Come on. The T100 is going to go here. Third place on the podium. That's a good place for that bike. That may have overperformed from what some of you were expecting, but I feel good about that. I hope you feel good about it too. And if you don't, I'm sure you'll tell me all about it in the comments. In the meantime, thank you for hanging out for this episode of Daily Rider. Very much appreciated. I hope you learned something. I hope you had fun. And I hope to see you next time. And someone's backing up, so we're going to go now. See everybody.
Well, I got my footless stops dialed now that we're not in that part of the course anymore. Jeez Louise and cheese, everybody. All right.